Welcome to one of our seminars in the READ seminar series, the Resources, Environment and Development program. My name is Frank Jotzo. I'm here on the academic faculty of the Crawford School of Public Policy, and we're joined by several READ academic colleagues in the room here, and of course by a number of you online. Thank you very much for joining. This is also a point in time to acknowledge that we are, of course, on First Nations land here in Canberra, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. We're looking out on some native grasslands just over the lake here in Canberra. Beautiful location. Please do come and visit us sometime. So we're very fortunate today to have an opportunity for an in-depth session with Honorary Associate Professor Nick Rowley, who recently joined Crawford School from the London School of Economics, in fact. And Nick has been involved in advisory and analysis, of course, of climate change policy, among other areas of public policy for a very long time indeed. Nick, maybe longer than you care to remember. I feel the same way, Nick. I'll turn the camera on so you see Nick here as well. So just some of the things Nick's been involved in advisory of implementation of the Kyoto Protocol. He's been advisor to a former New South Wales Premier, Bob Carr, at the time, and very importantly, he was an advisor to the UK Prime Minister Blair on climate policy issues as well. And in that capacity, Nick, I understand that you were instrumental in helping kick off the Stern review of the economics of climate change, which is something that I still point our students to as kind of a benchmark work in this field. So yeah, we really want to use this opportunity for Nick to set out some thoughts on whether net zero can still be achieved and how that sits more broadly in the dark art of policy design and policy implementation, and to use that actually as an opportunity for discussion as well. So without further ado, Nick, over to you.
Thanks very much, Frank. I'm going to stand here. Does that work?
It will.
Okay. All right.
I think you'll be good like that.
Okay. It's nearly Christmas. It's humid. It's hot. There are many other things to do. I'm going to try and keep this as high energy as I can. It's stuffy in this room. Hopefully it's nicer for everybody who's online. Thank you very much, Frank, for that introduction. I was at an event on Sunday and there was a comedian called Peter Berner who had a similar introduction, and I thought it was really funny when he stood up and said, for all the younger people in the room, write your own CV, it's bound to sound good, which I thought was quite sort of funny. But yeah, I probably worked a little bit here, there and everywhere in trying to respond to the global climate problem. And what I wanted to do today in this seminar is to think quite deeply about how I could be useful. And I thought maybe a useful thing to address is these 5 reasons that I've identified for possible despair and 5 reasons for potentially optimism in terms of how it is we might achieve this goal of net zero by 2050 or thereabouts. And it's really hard to think in optimistic terms. We've got a war in the Middle East. We've got severe weather events in Spain and the UK. It's really hard to find the space for optimism on our ability to tackle the problem. I'm going to try. Things have looked bad before, and yet there are real signs that political will and good policy have helped drive emissions reduction in the UK, in Europe, and yes, even in Australia. Frank can tell us from his work, post the carbon price, on the impact of the short-lived carbon price here in Australia being between 11 and 17 million tonnes of abated CO2 emissions. I leave it up to the audience to think whether or not that's cause for optimism or despair. It may be optimism that we can do this, and precious few people noticed that we were doing it as we were doing it, but it might be cause for despair in terms of the political environment that we operate in, where now we can't even talk about climate or a carbon price as a potential tool of public policy. Too often, I think, those of us who care deeply about the importance of addressing the climate problem with urgency and tackling the climate crisis in inverted commas is presented simply as a matter of will and overcoming vested interest. People want climate action now, and failure to act equals betrayal of some kind and a questioning of motive. I think this is deeply unhelpful. And yet, for those more skeptical of the need for urgency, decarbonising the global economy is presented as either an unachievable fantasy or, for some, an undesirable goal. I think the challenge is to retain some balance in these perspectives. And I'm with the German-American social psychologist Erich Fromm when he says, the difficulty of the task must not be a reason to abstain from trying to know the difficulties, as well as the conditions for its achievement. So whether in Australia or globally, in addressing the challenge of achieving net zero in Fromm's spirit, what I will present here are 5 factors which justify a fear that net zero will prove beyond us, and 5 factors which reveal that net zero can and will be achieved. And you don't have to have lived through the history of Australian climate policy from Robert Hill's first greenhouse office under the Howard government through to Scott Morrison's net zero brochure, through to whatever it is that the current Labour administration is undertaking to appreciate that reducing the risks associated with a rapidly changing climate and achieving net zero emissions by 2050 represents a truly wicked policy and political problem. This is really, really hard. We can't wish it simple. It's what Lord Stern of Brentford called in his 2006 Oxonia lecture, a complex intertemporal international collective action problem under uncertainty. And even with clear political commitment, this is a policy problem beyond compare, in my view. It involves delinking economic growth from energy growth and energy growth from emissions growth and having to find ways of drawing down greenhouse gas from the atmosphere, and all within a demanding timetable across jurisdictional boundaries, using approaches and technologies, some of which have not been developed or used at scale. Sentences like that leave me breathless. And today I want to take a step away from the news, be that the latest flooding in Libya, Germany, Wales, Valencia, or Lismore, or the latest statement by the US president-elect, or the richest man in the world, and consider whether public policy is up to the job of achieving net zero. Cutting to the heart of it, I hope to get beyond the noise to perhaps appreciate the tune. And as we all know, public policy does not emerge in any vacuum. So in addressing this question, I'll be touching on the wider political, economic, technological, and psychological factors relevant to the question. So, firstly, let's look at 5 reasons for despair. You'll always know when we're at the beginning, the middle, and the end of this presentation, by the way, because of the bar at the bottom. So whether the slides are any good, you know how many they are, we're going to get through them, okay? So let's look at the 5 reasons for despair. There are probably more, and I'm sure you can identify more, but here are the 5 which I think, at least today, are most important. Firstly, the data reveals failure. Despite severe climate events, significant net zero commitments by governments and global businesses, and the rapid take-up of new renewable infrastructure and technologies, both measured global greenhouse emissions and atmospheric warming continues to increase. Since the Paris Agreement was ratified in November 2016, there's been a total increase of CO2 emissions of around 0.8 billion tonnes, being a total percentage increase of 2.2%. The bathtub is still filling up with little evidence that the tap is turning off. According to NASA and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, all 5 of the hottest years on record have occurred since the Paris Agreement was ratified, and more than 2023 being the hottest ever year, it was significantly hotter, plus 1.18 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial baseline. And the EU's Copernicus Climate Change Service believes it is now virtually certain that this year will be the hottest year beating the last. This October, was plus 1.65 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. 15 of the past 16 months have been beyond the Paris threshold. These aren't reasons for optimism. That's why I've put them up front in reasons for despair. So despite all the public concern, political interest, observed warming and severe climate effects, floods in Europe, drought and bushfires in Australia, hurricanes and drought in the United States. Policy is failing, and if you can't point to policy success, it is natural that despair can follow. Second reason for despair. At one level, it's simple, cost. Cost means different people, it means different things to different people within any economy. I won't dive into that. I can develop classes on those questions. And despite having helped bring notable economists into the climate policy space, I am not one. I'll defer to their expertise, but there are at least 4 factors to understand about how cost might thwart efforts to achieve net zero. 1, economic illusion. Dramatic renewable cost reductions to date can create a false belief that clean technologies will naturally come to dominate markets. The increased deployment and lowering costs of renewables has been significant. It is a powerful trend, but is it powerful enough? According to industry experts like Michael Liebrecht, who established Bloomberg New Energy Finance, displacing fossil fuels, and particularly natural gas, will require an extraordinary further drop in the price of renewables. This might be achieved, but it might not. And if it isn't, we won't achieve net zero by 2050. Secondly, not all clean technology is following Wright's law. In Europe, power purchase agreements for offshore wind has been as low as 20 euros per megawatt hour. Now it's close to 80. Electrolyzers are now twice as expensive to make in Europe than they were 5 years ago. A BMW 3 Series made in China costs half as much as one made in Germany. This leads to a decline in European competitiveness and Chinese dominance, hurting the EU economy and jobs, leading to a slowing of clean investment in Europe, tariffs, and a really bad economic and political cycle that could get worse. Thirdly, cost barriers to technologies that will be required. So achieving net zero is going to require that some carbon capture and storage facilities are built rapidly and are operating at scale within a decade. Yet CCS projects remain both rare and prohibitively expensive, currently ranging between $600 and $1,100 per tonne of CO2 sequestered. Although there is promise with projects like Santos's Moomba project in Australia, I can go through the data on that, but I'll skip forward. The world is going to need a lot of these. And I can't see how the technical challenges capturing, then transporting and sequestering CO2 won't prove prohibitively costly. Gee, I haven't even finished 2 and I'm starting to feel deflated. It finishes much better. Yeah. Stick with me. Fourth on costs, a lack of both available finance and investable projects. Despite multilateral efforts, clean energy investment in developing countries needs to increase significantly. Again, Bloomberg New Energy Finance estimates 2.8 trillion annually by the early 2030s. This is a question of both political will and logistical capacity. The political will is unlikely. Look at what happened in Baku at the last COP meeting and a Trump presidency. And simply finding or creating investable projects makes investment where it is most needed extraordinarily hard. And beyond what the numbers and factors such as these might reveal, any investment in reducing emissions faces the challenge of the short-term costs of policy being clear, whereas the longer-term benefits are not. These are costs for uncertain future benefit. Don Henry from the Australian Conservation Foundation tried to make the case that a carbon price would save the Great Barrier Reef. He was wrong. No policy in any single country can achieve that. That's just the nature of the problem we face. And although the costs might be relatively small, they are known and perceived, whereas the longer-term costs of inaction are not. The third reason for despair, our psychology means climate response will always remain contested. I've never had an interesting or useful conversation with any layperson who presents their subjective understanding of human nature. Well, that's meant to be a provocation. This is what human beings are like. Oh, really? What have you read on this question? Well, it's just how I saw them. And with pretty much everybody online, wherever you are, and the people in the room being social scientists, I'm sure I'm not alone in that. All I will say is that humanity is paradoxical, people are strikingly diverse and similar at the same time. And of course, there are very real constraints to action to tackle climate risk, which are rooted in where power resides. Whether the fossil fuel political economy or a media requiring contest, or our new modes of political communication undermining our trust in government and most institutions. These are all real factors. But also important are differences in human psychology and how we make sense of our relationship with natural systems. Work by Wildavsky, cited by Hume in Why We Disagree About Climate Change, and by Mark Maslin in the brilliant, I think, great 101 starter, very short introduction to global warming by Oxford University Press, reveals why some people will never be convinced. I won't go through this in detail, but there are real differences in how we perceive our relationship to natural systems. Whether we see nature as benign, predictable, bountiful, robust, stable, and forgiving, or whether we see it as ephemeral, fragile, precarious, and unforgiving, or capricious, with the appropriate management style being laissez-faire, or nature perverse and intolerant. I won't go into the detail of this work. I'm a big fan of Mike Hume's book, Why We Disagree About Climate Change. We need to understand why it is we do disagree about climate change. Why is this a contested space? And human psychology, I think, is extremely insightful when thinking about this. In my courses, I kind of develop games where people in the class present themselves and think about where they might place themselves, and therefore what implications that has for how we think about effective policy. It can be enormously insightful. But I do think that this work is insightful for the people who are listening to what I'm saying, for all Australians, for those who vote in marginal constituencies, and even more insightful when you consider different cultures in different countries. So when you think about that chat between Elon Musk and Donald Trump, don't dismiss it as a way of making sense of the world. It's vital to try and understand it. It's got a lot to do with power, ego, self-interest, and psychological need. But with strongly different views on how they and humanity relate to nature and natural systems, certain people and decision makers cannot be educated out of apparent ignorance on climate risk. So sadly, it is our psychology which gives further cause for possible despair about our capacity to achieve net zero. A fourth reason for despair: net politics and net policy equals net commitment. Net. The trouble with a net policy commitment is it allows a get-out clause. Viewed in this way, net zero is a little like a commitment to being net loyal in a marriage. I've been married for more than 30 years, just want to make that clear, and I'm very happily married. And I haven't had a net arrangement, just to be clear. I don't think people are really interested in this, but so it allows disloyalty, a night of passion with another man or woman, because all the other nights have maintained fidelity. So in announcing 100 new oil and gas licenses in the North Sea, British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak could state that this was entirely consistent with the government's legislated commitment to achieve net zero by 2050. A net commitment also helped Tanya Plibersek here in Australia approve 3 new coal mines in New South Wales. And the politics of net zero is fraught. Achieving the policy stability and continuity that effective climate response requires is hard. And more than a lack of political leadership on climate change and achieving net zero, there is now a growth in a politics overtly hostile to it. In France, whose 2018 Yellow Vest protests were copied in Canada and elsewhere, Marine Le Pen's climate skeptic Rassemblement National won 41.5% in the 2022 presidential election. I can go into Germany. It could get worse. And all of this is in developed economies. In developing economies, where much of the decarbonisation of the global economy must now happen, there's even less interest. Recent work on the major global concerns by Ipsos found that climate change comes only 9th far behind inflation, poverty, unemployment, crime, corruption, health, and taxes. So although people care about climate change, and they might say we should achieve net zero by 2050, many seem to care more about immediate priorities. Rather like deciding to get fit in the future while eating a burger. People agree it's important, but what is their willingness to really change their decisions and behaviours? My fifth reason for despair, it's unclear whether the world can supply the vast amounts of minerals required to achieve net zero. This is a challenge born not of politics, but of supply and logistics. Bloomberg New Energy Finance again estimates that there will need to be a 5-fold growth in mineral demand from clean energy technologies to reach net zero. And demand for lithium is likely to increase by a factor of 14, rare earths by a factor of 11, copper by a factor of 6. And investment in the mining sector is increasing, but again, according to the International Energy Agency, not fast enough. Even if all planned mining projects entered production by 2030, that would still deliver just 75% of the minerals required to achieve net zero. Plans and activities could be accelerated, but at what environmental and wider human risk? So happy days. What a lovely slide. We are failing. The costs are enormous. Our response will always be contested. The politics is in the wrong place, and we can't produce enough materials to drive net zero. We cannot leave it at that. What are the reasons for optimism? I'll give it a go. Renewable energy is cheap and becoming cheaper, proven, and is being installed with pace and at scale. As recently as 2014, The Economist stated that solar power was by far the most expensive way of reducing emissions. The experience of the past 10 years reveals this to be wrong. As the technologies to harness, distribute, and store renewables become more sophisticated, they become both more efficient and cheaper. Existing fossil fuels and nuclear don't. The solid trajectory of increasing deployment and decreasing cost of renewables is something that the global energy system has not achieved ever before. Solar voltaic electricity costs have plummeted 82% between 2010 and 2019, falling from 0.36 to 0.068 per kilowatt hour. The dramatic price decline means that clean energy in many markets is now economically competitive with and often cheaper than fossil fuels. This is not prediction, it is happening. I just thought it would be nice to put some slide up there just to show you how quickly these technologies have changed through time. When I worked with Bob Carr, he used to say to me, the trouble with solar, Nick, is it's always 5 years away into the future. Not anymore. Not anymore. This is not prediction, it is happening. The benefits of change need to be now and they need to be visible, and they are. The International Energy Agency now projects renewable energy capacity will expand by 50% between 2022 and 27. This represents an initial 2,400 gigawatts of clean energy, equivalent to China's entire current energy generation capacity. And wind and solar technologies are becoming increasingly sophisticated, with some advanced solar panels now converting over 47% of sunlight into electricity, nearly double the efficiency of a standard panel a decade ago. This ongoing technological improvement promises continued performance breakthroughs that will make renewable energy more reliable, powerful, and deployable. And experience shows that when the transition away from fossil fuel starts, it often gains momentum. If someone had told me when I worked at Downing Street in 2005 that the UK wouldn't have a single functioning coal-fired power station by 2024, I would have said that would be impossible. But that is where we are. And that is a result of political will, technological breakthroughs driven by human ingenuity and good policy. The second reason for optimism, commitment comes before action, and there is significant global support for net zero. Net zero isn't a commitment born of obscure scientific analysis and seen as a nice thing to do. It is based on an international agreement made at Paris in 2015, requiring states to achieve a balance between anthropogenic emissions by sources and removals by sinks of greenhouse gases in the second half of the century. That translates to net zero by around 2050. We do not have global government, but metaphorically viewed from Mars, Having an active global agreement with processes requiring nations to be explicit about their nationally determined contributions to reducing emissions is a significant global achievement. We shouldn't fail to recognize that. Of course, the what questions are far easier than the how questions, but commitment to net zero is not niche. The last time I checked Net Zero Tracker, the net zero goal has been adopted by 147 of 198 countries, 1,176 of the 2,000 largest publicly traded companies by revenue, 189 of the 710 regions in the world. Without seeing the plans, the numbers, the laws, the regulations, and investment required to achieve the goal, one should be skeptical, but I don't think one should be cynical. A third reason. Technological innovation and climate response are now in lockstep. Net zero will require an intelligent, interconnected energy ecosystem. This will be and is being driven by systematic innovation involving new infrastructure, a new skilled workforce, and new ways of generating, storing, and distributing energy. It will also require changes in transport, construction, and agriculture. The grid of the future will include multiple technologies: wind, solar, batteries, demand response, pumped storage, possibly green hydrogen. Each technology can compensate for another's limitations, creating a robust, resilient system. The dual trends of low carbon and technological innovation are underway. I was thinking of what a slide might be to kind of get that across, but they were all so eminently facile of people on computers looking overly attractive with whiz-bang things all behind them. And then I was thinking I'll just put a book cover on the slide, which I didn't do, but I think J. Doyle Farmer's work on the relationship between low carbon and technological innovation are really, really insightful and important in terms of how these things can become mutually reinforcing. Already we can lift our phones and understand the electricity being generated from our roofs and going to our cars or our domestic batteries. More than optimism, cost and system efficiency are likely to increase uptake at scale, incentivizing more efficient electricity use. When wind generates excess power in one region, smart pricing will encourage consumers to charge electric vehicles or batteries in the home, or businesses smoothing supply and demand. For the people I know who really understand energy systems, this is an unfolding reality that provides a powerful third reason for optimism. Fourthly, arguments are now bolstered by lived experience. When I started working on climate policy in government, it was hard to get listened to, let alone heard. When I worked with Premier Carr in New South Wales, he was the only member of the state cabinet who thought it an issue that should concern the state. Working for the UK Prime Minister in Whitehall, the understanding of the science of the problem was high, but there was significant internal resistance to Tony Blair making it one of his 2 G8 priorities. The whole operating environment has now changed massively and rapidly. Sadly, this has largely been driven by severe climate events too numerous to present. They've now become almost ubiquitous. We can observe this, but the actuaries working on for the world's biggest reinsurance companies understand the numbers, and the trends are not good. Climate change is no longer a matter of scientific prediction. The changes are now both measurable and felt, and we are sentient beings. We respond to what we can see and feel. Lived reality is reshaping human perception and action. Even for people living in some of the wealthiest countries, extreme weather events, unprecedented heat waves, devastating hurricanes, prolonged droughts, and catastrophic bushfires have made climate change a tangible personal security risk. These experiences are bridging the gap between scientific understanding and understanding born of experience that changes decisions. At the same time, the visible proliferation of renewable energy infrastructure is providing a powerful counter-narrative of hope. The growth of offshore wind around the UK, rooftop solar in Australia, the efficiency and ever-lowering costs of solar energy, or the growth in electric cars can all be observed. Low-carbon alternatives are no longer future stories. They are practical, attractive, and scalable solutions. Eleanor Ostrom's brilliant work on collective action and common resource problems demonstrates how norms affect behaviour and decisions. Her identified relationships between standing, reciprocity, and trust are, I think, leading to greater cooperation to achieve net benefit. Low carbon is, I believe, becoming a new norm. And even the attention given to the next president of the United States' views on climate change reveals what is now considered aberrant. With climate action visible and tangible, momentum towards achieving net zero emissions by 2050, I believe, can build and strengthen. My final point, people with the required knowledge and ability. Earlier this morning, I presented a seminar with PhD and master's students on the 5 key attributes of any professional wanting to make a difference on climate change. Many of the brightest people want to work in roles and jobs where they are making a positive difference to the world. Climate change mitigation is increasingly attracting a remarkable cohort of talented professionals whose collective expertise and commitment represent a profound reason for optimism. Consider the breadth and depth of talent now converging on climate solutions. Brilliant engineers developing breakthrough renewable energy technologies, sophisticated financial experts designing innovative green investment products, policy specialists crafting new regulations, urban planners and designers reimagining sustainable city infrastructure, and climate scientists refining predictive models with unprecedented precision. That climate change is a human-induced problem and not an asteroid heading our way or a volcano about to erupt is an enabling truth. Our perspective and decisions on energy, agriculture, forest protection, and transport can and are making and will make a difference. So, renewable energy is cheap and becoming cheaper. There is abundant global commitment to net zero. Climate response and technological innovation are in lockstep. Arguments are now supported by lived evidence, and we have a cohort of brilliant people focusing on the task, or focused on the task of achieving net zero. All causes for optimism. We need to appreciate that as the risks from a warmer and more unstable atmosphere become more real, both causes for pessimism and optimism will, I believe, coexist in an uncomfortable and disruptive reality that ebbs and flows through time. So how should one be and seek to make a difference on the problem? We should, I think, take on the perspective of positive pragmatists, committed yet open. And the biggest factor guiding whether to be pessimistic or optimistic about our ability to achieve net zero is whether we choose to be one or the other. And it is our future that ultimately, it is our viewpoint that ultimately determines the future.